I am standing in the back of my own living room, hidden behind the velvet curtains I picked out for our 10th anniversary, watching my husband slide my grandmother's heirloom diamond onto my best friend's finger. The priest is whispering about "until death do us part," but I'm standing right here, breathing, bleeding, and very much alive. They think the stage 4 diagnosis I received 6 months ago was my funeral invitation, but they didn't realize that a dying woman has nothing left to lose and everything to burn. How did my soul sister end up in my silk robes before my heart even stopped beating? Why is my husband smiling at her with the same look he gave me at the altar? They are celebrating my transition while I'm still warm, but what they don't know is that I've already signed the papers that will turn their happily ever after into a living nightmare before the sun sets today. You think you know what betrayal feels like? You haven't seen anything yet because the ghost in this house isn't dead. She's just getting started with the reckoning. Before we go to the full story, please tell me from where you are watching. Tell me in comments, like the video and subscribe for more videos. The silence in our suburban estate used to feel like peace, a sanctuary built on 15 years of sweat, corporate climb, and a love I thought was bulletproof. At 42, I believed I had mastered the art of having it all. The senior VP title, the doting husband, and a friendship so tight with Monica that we shared a literal blood sister oath since college. But lately, the air in the master suite felt heavy, thick with a scent that wasn't mine. A hint of vanilla and expensive oud that lingered on Marcus's skin long after he claimed he'd been at the gym. I'd catch him staring at me, not with the warmth of a man in love, but with the clinical detachment of someone watching a clock wind down. My body felt like a foreign country, ravaged by the treatments that were supposed to save me, but only seemed to make me a ghost in my own hallways. I saw them whispering in the kitchen yesterday, their heads bowed together like conspirators over a map, and when I walked in, the silence was so loud it made my ears ring with a sudden, violent vertigo. Marcus didn't reach for my hand like he used to. He just adjusted his tie and checked his watch, his eyes darting to Monica, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern of our granite countertops. It was a small flicker, a moment of misplaced energy that shouldn't have mattered, but my intuition screamed that the foundation was rotting beneath us. I went to bed early, pretending to sleep, while the muffled sound of their laughter drifted up from the patio, sounding less like comfort and more like a victory lap. I reached for my phone to check the nursery cam I'd hidden. The screen flickered to life, a grainy black and white portal into the living room where my life was being dismantled piece by piece. I expected to see them drinking wine, perhaps discussing my medical bills or the logistics of my upcoming surgery, but what I saw made the blood in my veins turn to shards of ice. Marcus was sitting in his favorite leather chair, the one I bought him when he made partner, and Monica was draped across his lap like she owned the very air he breathed. Her hand, the one that had held mine during every chemotherapy session, was buried in his hair, pulling him closer as they whispered with a terrifying intimacy that bypassed years of friendship. I watched, paralyzed by a cocktail of morphine and pure, unadulterated shock, as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The exact box that held the ring I'd seen him browsing for months ago, thinking it was a vow renewal gift for our anniversary. He didn't say my name once. He didn't mention the woman upstairs fighting for her breath. He only looked at her and promised that the wait was almost over. They spoke about the transition, as if I were a piece of old furniture being moved out to make room for a new, shinier model that didn't cough or lose its hair in the shower. Monica giggled, a sound that sliced through my soul like a jagged blade, and told him that the lawyer had confirmed the life insurance policy was ironclad regardless of the circumstances. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of betrayal, as I realized they weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively planning for a life that started the moment I stopped. But then Marcus said something that stopped my heart. "She thinks the new specialist is in Switzerland," Marcus whispered, his voice dripping with a calculated malice I never knew he possessed. "By the time she realizes the paperwork she signed wasn't for a medical trial, but a full power of attorney transfer, the house and the offshore accounts will already be in your name, Monica." I felt the room spin, the walls of our beautiful home closing in on me like a tomb. Every document I had signed in my haze of pain and exhaustion flashed before my eyes. The long forms I trusted my husband to read, The legal jargon I'd brushed off because I was too tired to fight the fog in my brain. I wasn't just losing my health. I was being systematically erased from my own existence while I was still here to witness the theft. Monica kissed him. A deep, lingering betrayal that tasted of every secret we'd ever shared, every late-night confession, and every tear she'd wiped away with her lying fingers. She told him she couldn't wait to move her things into the primary suite, to throw out my depressing medical equipment, and turn my walk-in closet into her personal showroom. They were ghouls, picking at the carcass of a woman who was still fighting to stay in the light, fueled by a greed that had clearly been festering for years behind my back. I wanted to scream, to run down those stairs and tear the eyes out of the woman I called sister, but my body was too weak to carry the weight of my rage. I had to be smarter than my anger, more calculating than their cruelty, if I wanted to survive the night they had planned for me. I crawled back under the covers as I heard his footsteps on the stairs, my mind racing to find a way to stop the clock they had set for my demise. Marcus entered the room, the scent of Monica's perfume trailing behind him like a funeral shroud, and he sat on the edge of the bed with a performance of concern that would have won an Oscar. He touched my forehead, his hand cold and clinical, and asked if I needed my nightly dosage, the medication that usually sent me into a deep, dreamless slumber. For the first time, I looked at the pill bottle on the nightstand with suspicion, wondering if the medicine meant to heal me was actually the very thing ensuring I never woke up to see the sunrise. I feigned a coughing fit, hiding the pill under my tongue as I took a sip of water, watching him through half-closed lids as he waited for the chemical silence to take hold of my body. He stayed until my breathing leveled out. Then he leaned down and whispered, "Sleep well, Myra, it's almost time to let go," before slipping out of the room to return to his accomplice in the shadows. I waited until the house fell silent, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, before I spat the pill into a tissue and tucked it away as evidence of his silent war. I forced myself to sit up, the fire of adrenaline burning through the fatigue, and reach for the laptop I'd hidden beneath the mattress weeks ago when I first felt the shift in the wind. I didn't go to the bank accounts or the social media pages. I went straight to the private investigator I'd secretly hired when the ood scent first appeared, hoping I was just being paranoid. The folder he'd sent an hour ago contained more than just photos of them at a local jewelry store. It contained a medical report that Marcus didn't know I'd intercepted from his private email. My hands shook as I opened the PDF, reading the words that changed everything I thought I knew about my illness. The report didn't contain my name, but Marcus's, and the diagnosis wasn't cancer or any terminal illness. It was a sterile, cold confirmation of his own infertility and a secret vasectomy he'd had 5 years ago. My mind reeled because 2 years ago, I had suffered a devastating miscarriage with a child we both claimed to have desperately wanted, a loss that had sent me into the very spiral of health issues I was now facing. If Marcus couldn't father children, then the pregnancy that nearly killed me hadn't been a miracle, and the complications that followed weren't just bad luck. They were the result of a long-term plan to weaken my resolve. I scrolled further, my eyes blurring as I saw the receipts for the specialized vitamins he had been insisting I take for the last 18 months. The ones he said were for my immune system. They weren't vitamins at all. They were a cocktail of hormones and low-grade toxins designed to mimic the symptoms of a failing liver and a crumbling neurological system. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was the one actively killing me, using my trust as the delivery system for his slow-acting poison while Monica helped him refine the dosage. My best friend was a nurse, a woman who knew exactly how to hide the tracks of a medical murder, and she had been using her expertise to curate my slow departure from this earth. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over my heart, replacing the grief with a sharp, whetted edge of absolute, crystalline vengeance that would cut through their lives like a scythe. I wasn't a dying woman. I was a poisoned woman who had just found the antidote in the form of pure, unadulterated hatred. I picked up the phone and made one call to the one person Marcus feared more than the law. The voice on the other end was gravelly and sharp, the voice of my father's old business partner, a man who dealt in the kinds of secrets that never saw the light of a courtroom, but always found their mark. I told him everything, the pills, the nursery cam footage, the medical fraud, and the fact that I was currently being held hostage in my own body by the man I'd loved for a decade. He didn't ask me if I was sure. He simply told me to stay alive for 48 more hours and to keep taking the vitamins, but to hide them, to play the role of the fading wife until the trap was set. I spent the next day watching them through the camera, seeing Monica walk through my gardens, pointing at the rosebushes she wanted removed to make room for an infinity pool. She was wearing my favorite silk scarf, the one my mother gave me, and she laughed as she told Marcus that she'd already picked out her wedding dress for their hasty ceremony. They weren't even hiding it anymore, convinced that the fog in my brain was too thick for me to perceive the reality of my situation, or the proximity of my end. Marcus came in at noon with a bowl of soup, his face a mask of grief, telling me how much he'd miss my smile while he checked the levels in my bag with a practiced, murderous hand. I looked him in the eye and thanked him for being such a devoted husband, watching for a flicker of guilt that never came. Only the cold glint of a predator who thinks the prey is already dead. I had to endure his touch, his fake kisses, and his whispered lies, all while knowing that every breath I took was a countdown to his absolute and total destruction at my hands. But as he turned to leave, he dropped a small, crumpled receipt from his pocket that suggested the betrayal went even deeper than a simple affair and a murder plot. I waited until he was gone before I lunged for the small scrap of paper, my fingers trembling as I smoothed out the thermal print of a local storage facility I didn't recognize. The unit was registered in my name, but the contact number belonged to Monica, and the monthly fee was being paid from an account I had never seen before, one linked to my own social security number. I realized then that they hadn't just been stealing my health. They had been stealing my identity, building a parallel life using my credit, my history, and my hard-earned reputation as their personal piggy bank. If I died, the Myra they left behind would be a woman buried in debt and scandal, while the real assets would have been scrubbed clean and transferred to Monica under a series of offshore shells. They were planning to kill me and then murder my memory, leaving me as the villain of my own story while they rode off into the sunset with the millions I had spent 20 years building. I felt a surge of energy, a primal roar of defiance that pushed through the toxic haze in my blood, as I began to formulate the counterattack that would leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I spent the afternoon on my laptop, using the backdoors I'd built into my company's server years ago, moving the real assets into a trust that even a federal judge couldn't touch without my thumbprint. I was a senior VP of finance for a reason, and while they were playing house, I was playing a high-stakes game of digital chess that would end with their king in a corner with nowhere to run. I heard them downstairs, popping a bottle of champagne, the cork hitting the floor with a festive thud that sounded like a gunshot in the silence of my bedroom. Little did they know, that celebration was the last moment of peace they would ever experience in this life. The next morning, the house was a hive of activity as Monica's decorators arrived, people I'd never met who began measuring my rooms for a renovation I hadn't authorized. I watched from the top of the stairs, a frail shadow in a nightgown, as they discussed tearing down the walls of the library where I'd spent countless hours building my career. Marcus saw me and didn't even try to hide the annoyance in his eyes. I was a lingering guest at my own funeral, a nuisance who was taking too long to simply fade away into the background. He walked up the stairs, his voice a low hiss, telling me to go back to my room because the stress of the house was clearly making me delusional, and I needed to rest for the big day tomorrow. I asked him what was happening tomorrow, playing the role of the confused, dying woman to perfection, and he gave me a smile that was so devoid of humanity it made my skin crawl with 1,000 invisible spiders. "Tomorrow is the day you finally get the peace you deserve, Myra," he said, his hand tightening on my arm just enough to leave a bruise that would be gone by the time they put me in the ground. I let him lead me back to bed, nodding like a broken doll, while inside I was screaming with a rage that felt like it could boil the very blood out of my veins. I waited for him to leave before I pulled the burner phone from its hiding spot and sent the signal to my father's partner. "The stage is set. Bring the cameras." I knew that the specialist Marcus had hired for tomorrow wasn't coming to heal me, but to provide the final legal injection that would end my life under the guise of mercy. He had already forged my signature on the DNR and the request for assisted passing, a final act of legal theater that would make him the grieving, wealthy widower. But I had one more card to play before the doctor arrived. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I got out of bed, dressed in my best black suit, and applied enough makeup to hide the hollows of my cheeks and the gray tint of my skin. I looked like a woman who had risen from the dead, a specter of the powerhouse I used to be, and I moved through the dark house with the silence of a predator who knows every inch of the terrain. I went to Marcus's office, the one room I was forbidden to enter, and I began the process of physical evidence collection. The real ledgers, the hidden burner phones, and the vials of vitamins he kept in the safe. I found the marriage license, dated 3 months ago, already signed and witnessed by a crooked notary, proving that they were already married in the eyes of some back alley law while I was still in the house. They hadn't even waited for the assisted passing. They had replaced me legally while I was still tucked into the bed upstairs, a secret union built on the grave of my trust. I photographed everything, uploading the files to a secure cloud server that would distribute the contents to the board of directors, and the police the moment I hit a single button. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction as I realized that every kiss they had shared in this house was a legal nail in their own coffins, a record of bigamy and fraud that would be impossible to explain away. I was about to leave when I heard a floorboard creak behind me, and the smell of vanilla and oud filled the room, making my heart stop in my chest like a stalled engine. I turned around to find Monica standing in the doorway, a heavy brass lamp in her hand and a look of pure, murderous intent in her eyes that told me she was done waiting for the poison to work. She didn't say a word, she just lunged. The struggle was brief but violent, my desperation giving me a strength that the toxins hadn't yet managed to fully extinguish, and I managed to shove her back against the mahogany desk. As she fell, a folder spilled out of her bag, and I saw a series of photos that didn't feature Marcus or me, but Monica and a man I recognized instantly as our primary oncologist. The betrayal wasn't just a husband and a best friend. It was a medical conspiracy involving the very doctor I had trusted with my life, a man who had been paid off to misdiagnose me. I wasn't sick, I had never been sick. The entire stage for diagnosis was a fabricated lie, supported by altered lab results and a doctor who was deeply in debt to Monica's family. They had convinced me I was dying so they could pump me full of toxins that would eventually cause the very symptoms they claimed I already had, a self-fulfilling prophecy of death. I stood over her, the realization washing over me like a tidal wave of fire, realizing that the end they had planned was nothing more than a cold-blooded execution for a crime I hadn't even committed. Monica looked up at me, a sneer twisting her beautiful face, and told me that it didn't matter what I knew because no one would ever believe a delusional, terminal patient over a respected doctor and a grieving husband. She laughed, a dry, rattling sound, and told me that the police were already on their way, because Marcus had called them to report that I'd had a violent, drug-induced breakdown. I heard the sirens in the distance, the wail of authority coming to take me away to a psychiatric ward where I would be silenced forever, exactly as they had planned. I had only seconds to decide if I was going to run, or if I was going to stand my ground and reveal the monster hiding behind the mask of my sister. But as the front door burst open, it wasn't the police who walked in, but a team of federal agents I hadn't called. The agents swarmed the room, their weapons drawn, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking at Monica, who was suddenly scrambling to hide the photos of the doctor. I realized then that my father's partner hadn't just called his associates. He had contacted the FBI's Medical Fraud Task Force, which had been investigating our oncologist for months for a series of suspicious patient deaths. My case was just the tip of the iceberg, the final piece of evidence they needed to bring down a ring of insurance fraud and systematic murder that spanned 3 different states and dozens of victims. Marcus came running into the room, his face pale and sweating, trying to play the part of the confused husband, but the agents ignored his pleas and began cuffing Monica on the spot. I stood there, the suit I'd put on feeling like armor, as I watched the woman who had tried to steal my life be dragged out of my home in the middle of the night. Marcus tried to reach for me, his voice trembling as he told the agents that I was unstable and needed medical attention, but I simply held up the burner phone and the vials of poison I'd recovered from his safe. The lead agent took the evidence with a grim nod, looking at Marcus with a level of disgust that told me his career, his reputation, and his freedom were officially over as of this moment. I watched as they read him his rights in the very hallway where he had promised to love and cherish me. the irony of the moment tasting like the finest wine I'd ever had the pleasure of drinking. But as they led him away, Marcus turned his head and shouted something at me that made the room go cold again. A final jab that suggested the nightmare wasn't quite over yet. He told me to check the basement, to look behind the false wall in the wine cellar, because there was something there I had forgotten about our first year of marriage. The agents pulled him out before I could ask what he meant, leaving me alone in the house that had become a crime scene. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement, my legs shaking not from the poison, but from the sheer weight of the secrets that were still surfacing like bloated bodies in a lake. The wine cellar was cold and damp, the air smelling of earth and old grapes, and I began searching the walls for any sign of the false panel Marcus had mentioned with his dying breath of freedom. I found it behind a rack of vintage Bordeaux. A small, recessed lever that opened a narrow door into a room that didn't appear on any of the house's original blueprints or architectural plans. Inside, the room was clinical, filled with filing cabinets and a single desk with a computer that was still humming, its screen glowing with a list of names that made my heart stop. It wasn't just a list of victims. It was a list of investors who had been funding Monica and Marcus's lifestyle, people who expected a return on the assets they were liquidating from me. I realized that my husband and my best friend were just the front-facing operatives for a much larger organization that specialized in the high-net-worth erasure of wealthy women like myself. I began scrolling through the files, finding photos of other women I knew, business rivals, socialites, and friends, all of whom had died of natural causes or terminal illnesses in the last 5 years. I was supposed to be the latest payout, a multi-million-dollar liquidation that would have funded the next round of acquisitions, for a group of predators that hid in plain sight. I felt a chill that no amount of clothing could warm, realizing that I had stumbled into a hornet's nest that was far more dangerous than a simple domestic betrayal or a cheating husband. I needed to get this information out, to send it to the agents who had just left, but the computer suddenly beeped, a red warning flashing on the screen that indicated a remote wipe had been initiated. I scrambled to save what I could, but the files were vanishing before my eyes, deleted by someone who was watching me through the very camera I had used to watch Marcus. I lunged for the hard drive, trying to physically rip it from the machine before the data was lost, but the room was suddenly flooded with a bright, blinding light from a hidden overhead source. A voice came over a speaker, a voice I didn't recognize but one that sounded calm, professional, and terrifyingly powerful, telling me to step away from the desk if I wanted to survive the night. "You've been a very resilient subject, Myra," the voice said, "but you're interfering with a process that is much bigger than your petty grievances with a disloyal husband and a greedy friend." I realized then that Monica and Marcus were just pawns, sacrificial lambs being thrown to the wolves to protect the organization from the FBI's growing interest in their medical fraud scheme. They had let the agents take my husband and my friend because they were no longer useful, but I was a loose end that they couldn't afford to leave untied in the wreckage of my own life. I looked up at the camera, my eyes narrowed with a defiance that was now a permanent part of my soul, and told them that I had already sent the cloud link to the federal task force. The voice laughed, a cold and hollow sound, and informed me that the cloud I had used was a server they owned, and the agents who had come to my house were under review by their own internal affairs. I was alone in a house that was no longer a home, surrounded by enemies I couldn't see, and holding evidence that was disappearing like mist in the morning sun. I felt the familiar fog of the toxins starting to cloud my vision again, a secondary effect I hadn't expected, and I realized that the air in the room was being laced with something to put me down. I had to get out, to find a way to the surface and into the world before the darkness took me for good, but the door I had entered through was now locked from the outside. I was trapped in my own basement, a high-tech tomb built by the man I'd loved, waiting for the final sleep they had been promising me for months. I felt my knees buckle, the floor rushing up to meet me as the gas began to take its toll, but I managed to grab a heavy bottle of wine from the rack and smash it against the reinforced glass of the server cabinet. The sparks from the short-circuiting electronics ignited the alcohol, creating a sudden, violent flare of heat and light that set off the fire suppression system and the emergency alarms. The door's electronic lock clicked open as the house's safety protocols overrode the manual override, and I crawled out of the room, gasping for air that didn't taste like chemicals and metallic death. I made it to the stairs, my vision blurring into a kaleidoscope of red and orange as the fire began to spread through the basement, fueled by the rows of high-end spirits and old wood. I burst through the kitchen door and into the cool night air, collapsing on the lawn as I watched my beautiful, betrayed home begin to burn with a ferocity that matched the fire in my own heart. I saw a black SUV parked at the end of the driveway, its lights off, watching the flames with a silent, predatory patience that told me they were waiting to see if I made it out alive. I didn't run to the neighbors or call the police. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had managed to save from the basement. A physical ledger that hadn't been digitalized. It contained the real names of the board members who had authorized my erasure. Names that would shake the very foundations of the city's elite and the corporate world I had once served. I saw the SUV start to move toward me, the engine a low growl in the night, and I knew that this was the moment where I either became a victim, or I became the storm that would wash them all away. I stood up, the heat from the fire at my back, and I didn't flinch as the car stopped just inches from where I stood, the window rolling down to reveal a face I never expected to see. The person in the car wasn't a hitman or a corporate goon. It was my mother, a woman who had been declared dead 10 years ago after a tragic accident that had left me with a massive inheritance. She looked at me with eyes that were as cold and calculating as my own had become, and she told me to get in the car if I wanted to know the truth about why I was really targeted. This was never about Marcus or Monica, Myra, she said, her voice like silk over gravel. This was your initiation into the family business, a test to see if you had the spine to survive the call. I realized with a sickening clarity that my entire life, my career, my marriage, and even my illness had been a choreographed play directed by the woman who had birthed me and then faked her own death. The organization wasn't a group of strangers. It was a legacy, a dark empire built on the systematic acquisition of wealth through the very means I had just narrowly escaped with my life. She had watched me suffer, watched Marcus poison me, and watched Monica try to replace me, all to see if I was worthy of the seat she had been holding for me in the shadows. I looked back at my burning house, at the ruins of the life I had built for myself, and then back at the woman who had turned my existence into a twisted game of survival and greed. I got into the car, not because I was joining her, but because I needed to be close enough to the heart of the monster to ensure that I could be the one to finally rip it out from the inside. As we drove away from the glowing embers of my past, she handed me a new phone and told me my first assignment was already waiting for me in London, involving a man I had once loved even more than Marcus. I realized then that the war hadn't ended with the fire. It had only just expanded into a global battlefield where the only rule was that the dead stay dead, and I was the only ghost who refused to haunt quietly. But then she told me the most terrifying thing of all. Marcus wasn't in jail. He was already waiting for us at the private jet, and he wasn't my husband, he was my brother.